All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to connect the dots on two huge stories that on the surface seem totally separate, but they're actually dangerously intertwined. We're talking about the massive youth protests you've seen shaking South Asia and a much older, much riskier geopolitical game being played out in the shadows.
This quote, wow, it just nails the raw, explosive energy that's fueling this generational uprising across South Asia. You see, it's not just about politics anymore. It's about a fundamental, deep-seated sense of fairness. All right, let's really get into it.
So what happened? Well, back in 2024 and into 2025, it was like a seismic wave of youth-led protests just completely rocked the region. It kicked off in Bangladesh, and then that energy echoed right over into Nepal. And what it signaled was this dramatic, powerful political shift, all driven by the younger generation.
Now, what's interesting is that the initial sparks were different, right? In Bangladesh, it was all about a job quota that just screamed nepotism. Over in Nepal, it was a ban on social media platforms. But here's the thing. Both of those small sparks turned into these massive fires that spread incredibly fast. They grew from a single complaint into a full-blown challenge against the entire system, which young people saw as corrupt, unfair, and just totally out of touch.
And look, this anger isn't just coming from nowhere. It's rooted in a really stark economic reality. If you look at the data from Bangladesh, almost a third of young people are what's called NEET. That's not in employment, education, or training. Just think about that. That's millions of educated, ambitious young people with absolutely nowhere to go. When you have that many people with no real opportunities, you've basically got a massive pool of frustration just waiting for a spark.
And this is where Gen Z really showed their power. They completely turned the tables. As soon as governments tried to clamp down with censorship, this generation's digital fluency gave them a massive upper hand. We're talking TikTok, VPNs, encrypted apps. They used the whole digital toolkit to organize and literally run circles around the authorities. And it wasn't just high-tech stuff. Even simple things, like everyone changing their profile picture to red, became these powerful symbols of defiance. It created movements that were leaderless and spread out, but somehow incredibly unified.
Okay, so a youth-led, digitally fueled protest against an entrenched system. Does that sound familiar at all? It absolutely should. Because this whole wave of protest has some really powerful echoes of another massive global event, the Arab Spring, which kicked off back in 2010.
The parallels are pretty striking, aren't they? You've got youth-driven anger, same core issues like corruption and unemployment, and the same use of digital tools to organize. But, and this is a big but, the differences are crucial. So far in South Asia, we've seen regimes toppled by intense public pressure, without it spiraling into the kind of prolonged, devastating civil wars we saw in places like Syria and Libya. The danger here is a bit more subtle. It's the risk of old, entrenched political parties swooping in and hijacking all that revolutionary energy for their own purposes.
And this brings us to the really crucial, hard-learned lesson from the Arab Spring. See, toppling a ruler, that's just step one. The real question is, what comes next? When you get rid of a regime that has spent decades systematically crushing any and all opposition, you create a massive power vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum, right? It doesn't get filled by those idealistic protesters from the streets. No, it gets filled by the most organized forces that were waiting in the wings, usually the military or other well-disciplined groups. That's the heavy lesson that's kind of hanging over everything that's happening in South Asia right now.
And that whole idea of a power vacuum, it's absolutely crucial because these moments of internal chaos, they don't happen in a bubble. They create an opening. So now we're going to pivot. We're moving away from the energy on the streets and into the quiet backrooms where a much darker game gets played. This is where a country's internal problems become a golden opportunity for bigger, rival powers on the world stage.
To really grasp this threat, we have to get a key term down cold: proxy war. So what is it? Well, think of it like this. You have two global heavyweights, two superpowers who want to fight each other. But a direct war? Way too risky. Might even go nuclear. So what do? They each pick a side in someone else's civil war or conflict. They pour in weapons, money, training. Basically, they fight their war through other people, on other people's soil.
And listen, this is not some abstract theory. This timeline is a brutal, real-world reminder of the human cost. The entire Cold War was littered with these devastating proxy wars. I mean, look at Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan. The battle for influence between the US and the Soviet Union in these places cost millions of lives and left entire countries in ruins for generations.
The formula for this is it's tragically simple. You take a country that's fractured by internal conflict,
Its government is weak, and boom, it becomes the perfect chessboard. Outside powers can just waltz in, find a local group whose goals happen to align with their own, and start funneling in support. And just like that, a local struggle for power gets transformed into a battlefield for a much, much larger global rivalry. Okay, so to see how this whole shadow game could really play out in South Asia today, we need to zoom in on a conflict that's been simmering for decades, one that's often overlooked. We're talking about the insurgency in Pakistan's absolutely massive and resource-rich province of Balochistan.
Yeah, this is not a new fight by any stretch of the imagination. The conflict in Balochistan is basically a 75-year story of grievance that started the very moment Pakistan was created. It has exploded into open warfare again and again, and the current insurgency, the one that kicked off back in 2004, is one of the bloodiest chapters yet, especially after the army killed a really charismatic and important tribal leader back in 2006, which just threw gasoline on the fire.
And the roots of this thing, man, they run deep. The Baloch people have their own distinct language, their own culture, a really fierce sense of identity that's separate from the rest of Pakistan. For decades, they've watched as their vast natural resources, we're talking huge amounts of natural gas, get piped out of their land with almost none of the benefits coming back to them. Meanwhile, all the political and military power stays firmly in the hands of Pakistan's Punjabi majority.
And today, it's like a perfect storm of modern problems has poured jet fuel on those smoldering embers. You've got these massive geopolitical projects like the huge Chinese-funded Gwadar port and a major gas pipeline, which locals just see as the latest form of exploitation. Then you throw in an influx of Taliban militants from across the border in Afghanistan, which brings in an even heavier military presence, and top it all off with a brutal government crackdown, including forced disappearances, while you've got a recipe for constant, escalating violence.
All right, so let's tie all these threads together now. You have the youth quakes in Bangladesh and Nepal on one hand, and this simmering, decades-long insurgency in Balochistan on the other. All this instability, it is not happening in a vacuum. For the region's biggest power, India, this isn't some distant problem. It's a direct, growing, strategic threat right on its doorstep.
And a number like this really drives the point home. 1,750 kilometers. That's the length of the open, visa-free border between India and Nepal. Think about that. No visas needed. So when your next-door neighbor, a country you share such a porous border with, descends into chaos, well, those problems are not going to politely stop at the border. That instability immediately becomes your own domestic security nightmare.
And this is exactly where the danger of a proxy war stops being theoretical and gets very, very real. For years, Pakistan has been pointing the finger, alleging that India isn't just watching from the sidelines. They claim that India is actively funneling money and sophisticated weapons to the Baloch rebels, using the insurgency to bleed its old rival Pakistan from the inside.
Now look, it's one thing for Pakistan to make accusations against its arch-rival. That's kind of expected, right? But it is a whole other level when those claims are quietly backed up by a respected Western academic. According to our sources, Christine Fair, who's a top Pakistan expert at Georgetown University, has said that Indian officials have privately admitted to her that they are, and I'm quoting here, pumping money into Balochistan. And when you hear that, well, it suddenly suggests there might be some real fire behind all that smoke, and that raises the stakes immensely.
And all of this leaves us with one final, and frankly, chilling question that really gets to the heart of the whole issue. When you have two historic rivals, both of whom have nuclear weapons, and they start fighting each other through proxies in a shadow war, what happens when someone miscalculates? What happens when a line gets crossed that you can't uncross? Because in a region armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, the biggest risk of all is that one day the proxy war stops being proxy.